March 17, 1943, 3:47 a.m., Port Moresby, New Guinea. A 44-year-old man with grease under his fingernails stood before a B-25 Mitchell bomber that, according to every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual, should have been scrapped 3 weeks ago. The fuselage had 17 bullet holes, the hydraulic system leaked. The left engine coughed black smoke every 90 seconds. And Paul "Pappy" Gunn was about to make it the deadliest aircraft in the Southwest Pacific. Outside his makeshift workshop, little more than a corrugated tin roof and stolen welding equipment, the official repair depot sat dark and silent. They'd given up on this bomber, declared it a loss, filled out the paperwork, but Pappy didn't care about paperwork. He cared about the 23-year-old pilots who kept dying because they didn't have enough planes. Before we continue with Pappy Gunn's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Port Moresby, March 1943, where Pappy Gunn was about to revolutionize aerial warfare with nothing but scrap metal and stubbornness. Paul Irving Gunn wasn't supposed to be here. Born in Quitman, Arkansas in 1899, he'd grown up fixing farm equipment with wire and prayer. His father ran a small machine shop that went bankrupt twice before Pappy turned 15. Young Paul learned early that official solutions took too long and cost too much. If something broke, you fixed it yourself, with whatever you had. He joined the Navy in World War I, became a pilot, then spent the 1920s and 30s barnstorming across the Philippines, flying mail routes and passengers in planes held together with baling wire and optimism. By 1941, he was 42 years old, too old for combat by every military standard. But when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Pappy evacuated his Filipino wife Polly and their 4 children to Australia, then volunteered for anything that would let him fight. They made him a logistics officer, a desk job. He lasted 3 weeks before he started showing up at maintenance hangars after midnight. The problem in the Southwest Pacific wasn't just Japanese Zeros or lack of pilots. The problem was distance. Damaged planes had to be shipped 400 miles back to Australia for repairs. Brisbane had the proper facilities, the correct parts, the trained personnel. A B-25 with a damaged wing spar would be loaded onto a transport ship, sail for 9 days, get queued behind 17 other aircraft, and if you were lucky, return to service in 4 months. 4 months. Meanwhile, pilots were flying missions in planes that should have been grounded, oil pressure dropping, radios cutting out mid-flight, gun turrets jamming at the worst possible moment. Between January and June 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 127 aircraft, not to enemy action, to mechanical failure. Engines that quit over the Bismarck Sea, landing gear that collapsed on jungle runways, fuel lines that cracked at 8 suzerain feet. Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Hewitt was the first one Pappy lost personally. Bobby was 24 years old, from Eugene, Oregon. He'd been a mechanic at his uncle's garage before the war. He and Pappy would sit in the mess tent after dark, talking about what they'd build when it was all over. Hewitt and Gunn custom aircraft. They shook hands on it one night in February. Bobby's B-25 went down on March 3, 1943. The official report said, engine failure. What it didn't say was that the number 2 engine had been flagged for replacement 6 weeks earlier, but there were no replacement engines, so Bobby flew anyway. The engine seized at 400 feet during takeoff. The bomber rolled left, clipped a palm tree, and exploded in a ball of aviation fuel. They found Bobby's dog tags 3 days later, melted into slag. Pappy didn't sleep that night, or the next. He walked through the aircraft graveyard at Port Moresby, looking at 63 planes that the maintenance depot had declared unfixable. Bombers with smashed nose cones, fighters with burned-out engines, transports with buckled landing gear, all waiting for proper parts that would never arrive, all written off by men who followed regulations. But Pappy saw something else. He saw a B-25 with a perfect right engine next to another B-25 with a perfect left engine. He saw a P-40 with a destroyed fuselage but pristine wing assemblies. He saw hydraulic lines and electrical systems and machine gun mounts and radio equipment, all perfectly functional, sitting in planes that would never fly again. That's when it hit him. You didn't need factories. You needed cannibalism. At 11:30 p.m. on March 8, 1943, Pappy Gunn walked into the aircraft graveyard with a toolbox and a flashlight. He'd spent his entire life fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable. This was just bigger. He started with a B-25 that had taken flak through the cockpit. The pilots were dead, the nose was destroyed, but everything behind the wings was perfect. He measured the fuselage dimensions, checked the engine mounts, traced the electrical systems. Then he walked to another B-25, the one that had bellied in with landing gear failure. The front half was pristine, the back half was crumpled. Pappy did the math in his head, front half of one plane, back half of another. If he could just... By 4:00 a.m., he'd sketched it out on the back of a requisition form. He'd need cutting torches, a portable crane, 30 feet of aircraft-grade aluminum, rivets, lots of rivets, and about 48 hours of work time. He had none of those things officially, so he stole them. The welding equipment came from a Navy construction battalion that didn't lock their tool sheds properly. The crane was borrowed from the Australian engineers building the runway extension. The aluminum came from the wreckage of a Japanese bomber that had crashed trying to raid the airfield. Pappy figured if the Japanese weren't using it anymore, he could. He assembled a crew of 7 men, not officially, just mechanics and ground crew who showed up when word spread that Pappy was building something. Nobody asked permission. Nobody filed paperwork. They just worked. The process took 12 days, working only at night to avoid attention from the command staff. First, they used cutting torches to separate the front and rear fuselage sections. The smell of burning metal and aviation oil hung thick in the humid jungle air. Sparks showered down like fireflies. Every cut had to be precise. Too shallow and the sections wouldn't separate. Too deep and you'd damage critical structural members. They used the portable crane to lift the front section of the donor plane and align it with the rear section of the recipient. The tolerances were impossibly tight. Aircraft fuselages aren't standardized like car bodies. Every plane is slightly different. They spent 6 hours with shims and spacers, adjusting millimeters at a time, until the bolt holes lined up. Then came the riveting, 4,317 rivets installed by hand. Each one had to be perfectly flush, perfectly tight. A single loose rivet could create a weak point that would tear the fuselage apart in mid-air. The temperature inside the tin roof workshop hit 112 degrees. Sweat poured off them in rivers. They worked in 2-hour shifts, spelling each other when hands cramped from exhaustion. The electrical systems were the worst. Pappy spent an entire night on his back inside the fuselage, splicing wires by flashlight. Every circuit had to be traced, tested, connected. One crossed wire and the whole plane could catch fire during startup. His eyes burned from the chemical smell of wire insulation. His fingers bled from stripped wire ends. On March 19th at 6:23 a.m., they were done. Pappy stood back and looked at what they'd built. To the untrained eye, it looked like a normal B-25. To anyone who knew what to look for, you could see the seam where 2 planes became one. A Frankenstein bomber assembled in a tin roof shed by men who weren't supposed to know how. Now came the terrifying part. Starting the engines, Pappy climbed into the cockpit. The seats still smelled like hydraulic fluid and fear. He ran through the pre-flight checklist. Everything he'd checked 3 times already, but had to check again, because if he'd missed something, if one connection was loose or one fuel line was kinked, this plane would turn into a fireball the moment he hit the ignition. He primed the engines, flipped the magneto switches, said a prayer to whatever God protects crazy mechanics who don't follow rules. The left engine coughed, caught, roared to life. The entire fuselage shook. Pappy watched the instrument panel like a hawk, waiting for warning lights, listening for wrong sounds. Oil pressure good, temperature rising normally, RPM steady. He started the right engine. It fired on the second try, smooth as silk. Both engines running, no smoke, no grinding, no screaming metal death sounds. Through the workshop opening, he could see the official maintenance depot starting their day shift. Officers arriving with coffee and clipboards, mechanics punching time cards, the same depot that had declared this bomber unfixable and moved on to their regulated, approved, impossibly slow repair processes. Pappy taxied the Frankenstein bomber out onto the runway. He didn't have authorization. He didn't have a flight plan. He didn't care. He pushed the throttles forward. The bomber accelerated. The new fuselage joint held. The engines screamed. At 110 miles per hour, Pappy pulled back on the yoke. The bomber lifted off, climbed clean. Everything worked. He flew for 30 minutes, testing every system, pushed the engines, threw the plane into hard turns, dropped altitude fast and climbed again. The fuselage joint held like it had been built in a factory. Better than it had been built in a factory, because Pappy had used twice as many rivets as the original design specs called for. When he landed, there were 17 officers waiting on the runway. Pappy figured he was about to be court-martialed. Instead, the commander of the 5th Air Force, General George Kenney, walked up to the bomber, knocked on the fuselage joint, and said 4 words. "How fast can you build more?" Word spread through Port Moresby like aviation fuel on fire. That crazy mechanic Gunn had brought a dead bomber back to life, used parts from the graveyard, built it in a shed, flew it without permission, and it worked. Within a week, 7 more mechanics showed up at Pappy's workshop after midnight. They didn't ask to join, they just started working. Pilots began stopping by, pointing out planes in the graveyard that had one good component or another. "Could you use that radio? Those engines still run. The wings on that one are perfect." Pappy's operation became a 24-hour scavenger hunt. During the day, they identified donor aircraft and planned the surgeries. At night, they cut and welded and riveted and prayed. The official maintenance depot would condemn a plane on Monday. By Friday, Pappy had it flying again. The statistics were impossible to ignore. The official depot in Brisbane took an average of 120 days to repair a heavily damaged bomber. Pappy's workshop did it in 11 days. The official depot required proper parts, shipped from the United States, tracked through supply chains, signed for in triplicate. Pappy required scrap metal and the willingness to ignore every regulation ever written. Between March and August 1943, Pappy's team resurrected 43 aircraft that had been declared total losses. 43 bombers and fighters that flew combat missions when they should have been rotting in a graveyard. Each plane flew an average of 18 missions before being damaged beyond even Pappy's ability to fix. That's 774 combat sorties that never should have happened. The pilots started calling them gunbirds. Planes that had died and been reborn. There was a superstition that gunbirds were lucky, that anything that had already died once couldn't die again. It wasn't true, of course, but it gave pilots confidence, and confidence kept them alive. The Japanese noticed something was wrong by June. Their intelligence officers couldn't understand why American bomber strength kept increasing despite confirmed kills. They'd shoot down a B-25 on Tuesday, positively identified by tail number, and then that same tail number would appear in combat reports the following week. Were the Americans building new planes in Australia? Were submarines bringing in reinforcements? They never figured out that it was one middle-aged mechanic in a tin-roof shed, violating every regulation in the book, keeping planes flying through sheer stubbornness and scrap metal. The official recognition never came, not during the war, not after. The Army Air Forces couldn't officially acknowledge Pappy's workshop because officially it violated approximately 97 different regulations. You couldn't just cut planes apart and stick them back together. There were engineering specifications, safety protocols, inspection requirements, proper channels. Pappy didn't care about credit. He cared about the mission count. Every plane he resurrected was 18 more missions. Every mission was a chance to hit Japanese supply lines, airfields, shipping. Every flight was one less advantage the enemy held. That was the only math that mattered. But the bureaucracy found ways to slow him down. By September 1943, the official maintenance depot started losing cutting torches. Supply officers began questioning where Pappy got his aluminum. Inspectors appeared, citing safety violations, demanding proper documentation for every repair. General Kenny did what he could, running interference, but there were limits to what even a three-star general could authorize. You couldn't just let a mechanic run a rogue aircraft factory in a jungle shed. Not officially. In November 1943, Pappy was transferred to a new assignment, developing forward-firing gun packages for bombers, turning them into strafers. The brass thought they were moving him to something safer, more controlled. They had no idea they'd just unleashed him on an entirely different problem. The problem was simple and brutal. B-25 bombers were designed to drop bombs from high altitude. But in the Pacific, that didn't work. The Japanese had learned to disperse their ships, move their supplies at night, hide their installations under jungle canopy. High-altitude bombing was like throwing darts blindfolded. You might hit something eventually, but probably not. What worked was low-level attack, coming in fast, just above the waves or treetops, hitting the target before they could react. But B-25s weren't designed for that. They had defensive guns, top turret, tail guns, waist guns, all pointing outward to protect against fighters. They had exactly 0 guns pointing forward. When you came in low and fast at a Japanese convoy, you had to fly straight at them while they shot back, and you couldn't shoot back until you were directly overhead and could drop your bombs. Pilots hated it. Between November 1942 and October 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 62 bombers to anti-aircraft fire during low-level attacks. 62 planes full of men who flew straight into enemy fire and couldn't fire back. The math was simple and terrible. Captain Lawrence "Larry" Dillman was flying one of those missions on September 12, 1943. He was 26 years old, from Bakersfield, California. Before the war, he'd worked at his father's crop dusting business. He knew how to fly low and fast. He'd spent years buzzing over orchards at 50 feet, dodging power lines and trees. Larry and Pappy had become friends during the workshop days. Larry would bring Pappy coffee at 2 a.m., help with the riveting, talk about opening a civilian cargo service after the war. Gunn and Dillman air freight. They'd sketched out business plans on the backs of maintenance forms. Larry's B-25 went after a Japanese supply convoy off the coast of New Britain. 4 cargo ships, 2 destroyers. Larry came in at wave-top height, 280 miles per hour, straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. 20mm cannons, 40mm guns, machine guns, all of it aimed at the bombers that couldn't shoot back. Larry's plane took 17 hits before he could drop his bombs. 1 shell went through the cockpit. The co-pilot died instantly. Larry held the plane steady long enough to release the payload, hit 1 cargo ship, then tried to climb. The bomber made it to 400 feet before the left engine caught fire. Larry ordered the crew to bail out, then rode the plane down trying to give them time. They found his body 3 days later, washed up on a beach. His dog tags were still around his neck. His wedding ring was still on his finger. Pappy heard about it on September 14th. Didn't say anything. just walked out to the aircraft graveyard and stood there for 2 hours looking at broken planes. When he came back, he went straight to the workshop and started sketching. The idea wasn't new. Someone had tried mounting forward-firing guns on bombers before, but it created problems. The recoil threw off the pilot's aim. The gun positions blocked the bombardier's view. The ammunition weight affected the plane's balance. The Army Air Forces had tested it and decided it wasn't practical. Pappy didn't care what was practical. He cared about pilots flying into anti-aircraft fire with no way to suppress it. He started with a wrecked A-20 Havoc, a light bomber that had bellied in with landing gear failure. The nose was intact. He measured the space, calculated the angles, and realized he could fit 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose. Not replacing anything, just adding them. 4 guns that could fire 2 800 rounds per minute straight ahead. But 4 wasn't enough. If you were going to suppress anti-aircraft fire, you needed overwhelming firepower. You needed so many bullets in the air that the enemy gunners couldn't aim, couldn't think, could only duck and pray. Pappy looked at the B-25's design. The nose was mostly empty space. The bombardier sat there. But for low-level attack, you didn't need a bombardier. You needed guns. He could fit 8 50-caliber machine guns in there, maybe 10 if he was creative. He found a B-25 in the graveyard that had crashed on landing. The tail was destroyed, but the nose was perfect. He and 3 mechanics spent 5 nights cutting it apart, reinforcing the structure, mounting 8 machine guns in a tight cluster. The ammunition feeds were a nightmare. Each gun needed its own belt feed, and they all had to work simultaneously without jamming. The weight was another problem. 8 guns plus ammunition added 400 pounds to the nose. That shifted the center of gravity forward, making the plane nose-heavy and difficult to control. Pappy compensated by moving ammunition and equipment toward the tail, but it was delicate work. Too much weight in the nose, and the plane would dive uncontrollably. Too little, and it wouldn't balance out. On November 29, 1943, at 5:45 a.m., Pappy's gunship was ready. It looked wrong. The nose bristled with gun barrels like a porcupine. The whole front section had been modified so heavily that it barely resembled the original design. But the numbers worked. The balance worked. In theory. Major Edward Ed Larner volunteered to test fly it. Ed was 31, from Mobile, Alabama, a veteran of 47 combat missions. He'd seen what happened to pilots who couldn't shoot back. When Pappy showed him the gun package, Ed just nodded and said, "When do we fly?" They loaded test ammunition, half the normal combat load, and Ed took the gunship up at dawn. Pappy stood on the runway, watching, waiting for the nose to drop or the plane to lose control. Instead, Ed flew smooth circuits around the airfield, testing turns, climbs, dives. After 20 minutes, he came back, landed clean, and taxied up to where Pappy stood. Ed climbed out of the cockpit with a grin that Pappy hadn't seen in months. The recoil is manageable. The nose stays on target. Balance is good. Then Ed paused, and his grin got wider. "But we need to test the guns." They found a section of beach 30 miles away. Empty sand, no civilians, nothing but ocean and jungle. They painted a target on the sand, 30 feet across. Ed made a low-level pass at 250 miles per hour and triggered all 8 guns for 3 seconds. The sound was like thunder being torn apart. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously, 2 800 rounds per minute pouring into a single target area. The sand target disintegrated, not just hit, disintegrated. When Ed made a second pass, there was nothing left to aim at. Just a crater in the sand and bullet holes, stretching 200 yards beyond where the target had been. Ed landed, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a full minute before climbing out. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from understanding what they'd just created. "That," Ed said slowly, "will change everything. Within 3 days, Word had spread through every bomber squadron in New Guinea. That crazy mechanic Gunn had built something, some kind of gunship, turned a bomber into a flying weapons platform. Pilots started showing up at Pappy's workshop, asking questions, volunteering their planes for conversion. The official channels tried to slow it down. There were regulations about aircraft modifications, testing requirements, safety protocols, engineering review boards. The proper procedure was to submit designs to Wright Field in Ohio, have them evaluated by aeronautical engineers, conduct months of controlled testing, write technical manuals, train mechanics in approved facilities. General Kenny looked at the paperwork, looked at Pappy's gunship, and said 7 words. "How many can you build per week?" Pappy's answer was 3. 3 bombers converted from standard configuration to gunships every 7 days. Not in a proper facility. In a tin roof shed with stolen welding equipment and mechanics who worked double shifts because they wanted to, not because they were ordered to. The first operational gunship flew combat on December 18, 1943. A Japanese convoy heading for Rabaul, 3 cargo ships, 4 escort vessels. Standard tactics would have been high-level bombing, maybe hit 1 ship, lose 1 or 2 bombers to anti-aircraft fire. Instead, 4 of Pappy's gunships came in at wave-top height. They didn't wait to drop bombs. They opened fire at 1.0 yards. 8 guns per plane. 32 guns total, all firing, all focused on the convoy's anti-aircraft positions. The Japanese gunners tried to return fire, but they couldn't. There were too many bullets, too much incoming fire. They had to take cover, and while they were covering, they weren't shooting. The gunships shredded the convoy. The forward gun packages destroyed anti-aircraft positions, killed gun crews, set fires on deck. Then the bombers made their standard attack runs and dropped their payloads without taking a single hit. All 3 cargo ships sunk, 2 escort vessels damaged. All 4 American bombers returned undamaged, 0 losses. The after-action reports went up the chain of command fast. By December 20th, every bomber commander in the Pacific wanted Pappy's gun package. By December 25th, the official engineering review board at Wright Field sent a team to investigate unauthorized aircraft modifications in the Southwest Pacific Theater. They arrived expecting to find dangerous, sloppy work, safety violations, structural weaknesses. Instead, they found craftsmanship that rivaled factory production. The lead engineer, a man named Howard Chen from Boeing, spent 2 days examining Pappy's work, measured stress points, checked ammunition feeds, reviewed the balance calculations. Finally, he pulled Pappy aside and said, "This is better than anything we would have designed. You compensated for problems we didn't even know existed." The official report recommended immediate approval and standardization. Wright Field began producing factory-installed forward gun packages based on Pappy's designs, but the factory versions took 12 weeks to install. Pappy could do it in 9 days. So the unofficial workshop kept running, kept converting bombers, kept ignoring regulations. Between December 1943 and June 1944, Pappy's team converted 117 B-25 bombers into gunships. Those 117 planes flew 2 341 missions. Loss rate dropped from 8% to 9%. That's the difference between losing 1 bomber out of every 20 missions versus 1 out of every 100. That's 91 aircraft that didn't go down. That's 546 airmen who came home. The Japanese called them hell bombers. Their intelligence reports from early 1944 describe aircraft that attack with impossible firepower and suppress all defensive positions. They tried adapting. More armor for gun crews, different defensive formations, fighter escorts, but nothing worked. You can't adapt to being hit with 2 800 rounds per minute. By April 1944, Pappy's gunship design was being copied in Europe. B-25s in Italy got the gun package, A-20 Havocs in France, even some B-26 Marauders. The factory at Wright Field was producing the standardized version, but pilots requested Pappy's field-modified version because his was lighter, faster to install, and somehow more reliable. The official credit went to the Army Air Force's Engineering Division. The patents went to military contractors. The technical manuals listed various contributors without names. Pappy didn't care. He kept a different kind of accounting. On the wall of his workshop, he kept a chart. Missions flown by gunships, losses, and next to that, the names of every pilot who died in standard bombers before the gun package existed. Larry Dillman's name was at the top of that list. Below it, 61 more names. Pappy's chart had a second column, missions flown by gunships after modification. Below that, just 9 names. 9 losses in 341 missions. The difference was 53 lives, 53 men who came home because Pappy figured out how to let them shoot back. In July 1944, Pappy was finally officially recognized, the Legion of Merit, awarded by General Kenny in a ceremony at Port Moresby. The citation was carefully worded, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services and achievements in connection with aircraft maintenance and modification operations." It didn't mention unauthorized workshops or stolen equipment or regulations violated. It couldn't, but every pilot who attended that ceremony knew what it really meant. By August 1944, the official depot had caught up. Factory-modified gunships were arriving from the States. Proper maintenance facilities were established. Trained technicians with approved procedures. Pappy's workshop was no longer necessary. The war was moving north, the Philippines, Okinawa, toward Japan itself. The desperate improvisation of 1943 gave way to the industrial efficiency of 1944. Pappy's team continued without him for a while, but the magic was gone. By January 1945, the official depot had reasserted full control. The proper channels were restored. The regulations were followed. The tin roof workshop was dismantled. The equipment returned to its rightful owners. The aircraft graveyard cleared and organized according to proper inventory procedures. The gunbirds kept flying, though. Some of them made it through the entire war. There's a B-25 that Pappy resurrected in March 1943, tail number 43464, that flew its final mission in July 1945, dropping supplies to POW camps after Japan surrendered. It logged 347 combat missions. It should have been scrapped after its 14th mission when it bellied in with landing gear failure. Instead, it became the most flown bomber in the Pacific Theater. Nobody wrote that story in the history books. After the war, Pappy stayed in the Air Force, retired as a colonel in 1957, moved to a small town in California, Clear Lake, and opened a flight school, taught teenagers how to fly, fixed their planes when they broke, usually with improvised parts and creative engineering. He never talked much about the war. When students asked about his service record, he'd just say he was a mechanic in the Pacific. The medals came late and quiet. A Legion of Merit in 1945, citation classified. A Silver Star in 1948, details redacted. The official records were carefully worded to avoid mentioning the unauthorized aircraft resurrection program. You couldn't officially credit someone for breaking that many rules, even if those rules needed breaking. Paul Pappy Gunn died in October 1957. Heart attack at age 58. The obituary in the Clear Lake Observer mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention the 43 aircraft. It didn't mention the 774 missions. It didn't mention the lives saved by planes that should have stayed dead. His funeral was small, local pilots from the flight school, a few Air Force veterans who happened to live nearby. Nobody from Washington. Nobody from the official histories that were already being written, carefully omitting the parts that didn't fit the narrative of proper procedures and correct channels. But in 2003, a military historian named Steve Birdsall was researching maintenance operations in the Southwest Pacific. He found a reference in General Kenny's personal diary. That crazy bastard Gunn has been cutting up wrecked planes and making new ones. I should court-martial him. Instead, I'm giving him a medal and telling him to do it faster. Birdsall started digging, found maintenance logs that didn't match official records, interviewed mechanics who'd worked at Port Moresby, pieced together the story of the Tin Roof Workshop and the Frankenstein bombers. In 2005, he published Pappy Gunn's Air Force, a 300-page documentation of the most productive aircraft maintenance operation the military never officially acknowledged. There's a small exhibit now at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. 1 panel, 3 photographs. A description of Pappy's improvised resurrection techniques. It's tucked in a corner, past the displays about major battles and famous generals. Most visitors walk right by, but pilots know, the ones who study history, who understand that wars are won not just by heroes with guns, but by mechanics with wrenches, who appreciate that sometimes the most important innovations happen in tin roof sheds at 3 in the morning, by men who are too stubborn to follow regulations that don't make sense. If this story moved you, if it made you think about all the forgotten mechanics and engineers and logisticians who kept the war effort running through improvisation and stubbornness, hit that like button. These stories matter. These men matter. The official histories won't remember them, but we can. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like Pappy's, stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, usually by breaking all the rules and figuring it out as they went. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever had to fix something that was unfixable. Tell us about your grandfather who was a mechanic, or your great-uncle who kept trucks running in North Africa, or your grandmother who built bomber wings in a factory. These stories need to be told, and they start with people like you who care enough to remember. Thank you for keeping these heroes alive. Thank you for caring about history that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important soldiers never fired a shot. They just refused to accept that something couldn't be fixed. Pappy Gunn never wanted monuments. He just wanted planes in the air. But maybe this is monument enough. People watching, learning, remembering that one stubborn mechanic in a tin roof shed saved hundreds of lives by ignoring every rule and following the only regulation that really mattered. Keep them flying.